Welcome back to the Fabulous Four podcast. Alongside me, I'm Double G, is Duan, my co-host here. And Duan, we are at a stage in with the Fabulous Four. We are near the twilight of their careers as we finish out these last two fights. The one that we're going to talk about today is Hearns and Leonard 2. And then the one for the next episode will be Leonard and Duran 3. And in the twilight, we see guys who are in their 30s, who are at a much higher weight, fighting at a higher weight than they were when we remember them at the beginning of this podcast that we started. And this fight is actually a really good fight if you just look at it from sort of a storytelling standpoint and from an action standpoint. Gone are the days of speed, lightning speed, amazing athleticism, and in place is really will, bravery, trickery, wisdom, and it's quite a different fight from the first one. As we get into this second fight between Leonard and Hearns, when you were watching this fight, which we'll get to, and you know, we're going to actually do some introductory stuff first, but I just want to know, as you were watching this fight, comparing it to the first one, what were your thoughts as you're watching these guys who are, 8 years older than they were and probably a couple years outside of their prime, just stalking each other and wanting it just as badly as they did the first go round?
Yeah, we said last time that, Leonard Hagler was really the last fight in this series where you saw the guys at the absolute peak of their powers. When we come back for this one, a little bit over 2 years on, and as you said, 8 years on since the first Leonard Hearns fight, there's no question that both guys have slipped a little bit. They're not the same fighters they were. They're both still really good, mind you, but they are that bit older, they're that bit heavier, and they're not quite in their prime anymore. And I think there's a funny thing about matchups that happen late in a fighter's career. Sometimes we dismiss them as being kind of meaningless, and other times they take on even more meaning. I guess, the example you'd go to for that would be the Thriller in Manila. That's perhaps seen as the best and most defining fight of the greatest period in heavyweight boxing history. And, that's kind of what Bob Arum was comparing this one to in the build. He was saying that this was their version of the Thriller in Manila. And, interestingly, Leonard and Hearns were a year younger, respectively, than Ali and Frazier were in that fight. Frazier had lost 2 of his last 3 going into that fight. So, sometimes you do get situations where, like you did in both of those fights, where, maybe the ability isn't what it once was, but the drive is still there. And I think that's definitely we got what we got when this one. And it's just, I guess, it's just a case of where you kind of see this one on that scale as to how important it was in both fighters' legacy. There's some fights that become part of boxing lore, and there's other contests, but for every one of them, there's a lot of contests that people would rather forget, that people look back on and say, well, it really didn't tell us anything about that fighter's legacy. And that's the big question with this one. What did it really mean in the grand scheme of this series?
So we are in a post Marvin Hagler era. He would never fight again, though there would be a lot of talk, seemingly every time, Sugar Ray or Tommy, thought about, what their next fight was. Hagler's name was always still there. And the middleweight division, which Hagler had such a stranglehold on for so many years, has changed because you have Hagler being champion for so long. Leonard comes in and he beats Hagler for the titles, and Leonard just says, "Hey, I didn't want the belts. I just wanted to beat Marvin, and so I don't want these belts anymore." So it kind of throws the middleweight division into a bit of a crazy space, and I know that you wanted to kind of talk about this and take a look at where we are or where we got to in the middleweight division post Leonard and Hagler.
Yeah, as you said, like Hagler had been the unified champion for 7 years. What happened then was obviously the IBF and the WBA titles were vacated due to him losing. They weren't on the line in that fight against Leonard. And then Leonard, he vacated the WBC title himself. So all the belts were open, as we closed out 87. Like in October 10th, Frank Tate picked up the IBF belt. In October 23rd, Sumbe Columbe won the WBA title, and then on October 29th, Tommy Hearns actually beat Juan Rodan for the WBC belt that Leonard had relinquished.
Did you have you gone back and watched that fight?
I have.
That is a crazy action fight. Roldan basically puts his head down and just starts swinging with both arms, and Hearns has got to find a way to like dodge this bull who is oncoming and still try to stay within his strategy and what he does best, which is create distance, use his jab, use that overhand right. And there's a point in that fight where, it's almost like, Roldan has such little chance of actually doing damage, but he does hit Hearns like one time, and you see Hearns buckle, and you're like, oh my God, like this strategy, which never works, may work here. But I mean, Tommy finished him off. But yeah, that was such a crazy fight. And you hear Hagler cackling in the background because he's doing the color commentary. Like, I told you this guy's style is weird. Like, I told you guys, this guy is awkward. Like, there's no fun fighting this guy. There's such an amazing time when, while Hagler is out of the picture, he's still kind of in the picture because he wants to keep an eye on what's going on, and he's going to make some easy money doing commentary. But he's kind of snickering almost. It was a version of Marvin Hagler that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and as you said, it was a really wild fight. It was like, I think this was another classic Tommy performance. Just a 4-round shootout where there were just punches flying everywhere. But all of those reigns that we just mentioned were really short. Then, it was a transitional period for the division. Columbe lost the IBF title to Mike McCallum in his first defence. Tate dropped the WBA title to Michael Nunn in his second defence. Tommy was upset by Iran Barkley in his first defence, and then Barkley lost to our old friend Roberto Duran, back from the dead once again. We thought he was written off after the Robbie Sims fight. He came back and he upset Iran Barkley. So at that point, belts are just moving around all over the place, and then the WBO comes into the picture as well in April of '89, and Doug DeWitt beats Robbie Sims for that belt. So now we have what would classically be known as the 4 big titles in boxing. When we started out this, it was just the WBC and WBA. The IBF joined during the Hagler era when, there was those arguments over 15 rounds, and they said, hey, if nobody else will sanction the fights, we'll sanction them. And now we've got the WBO coming in. There's a bit of a power struggle between them and within the WBA, and they broke away from that group to form their own sanctioning body, and they started, crowning new champions. DeWitt beat Sims, as I mentioned, and then, shortly after that, like a year after that, in his second defence, he lost the belt to Nigel Benn. Now, Nigel Benn is one of the great fighters of the next era in British boxing. When you talk about the classic era of middleweight, super middleweight boxing in Britain, you talk about, you kind of have a 4 kings for that as well. There's Chris Eubank, Nigel Benn, Steve Collins, and Michael Watson. And during kind of when I was growing up, those were kind of the big TV fights, and by Ben winning that title from DeWitt. That was kind of what ushered in that era in Britain. So even though we're coming to the end of a classic era in one part of boxing, there's another one being introduced on the other side of the Atlantic.
You mentioned Roberto Duran, and we're going to do a little bit of a catch up with him in the next episode as he faces Leonard. But Duran has a very interesting timeline here, because he takes after losing to Hearns in '84, Duran doesn't fight for like another year and a half, and then he loses to Marvin's little brother in '86. So how many lives does this guy have, right? Because then he reels off 6 straight, and like you said, beats Barkley for that super middleweight title, who had just beaten Hearns, and Roberto is always sort of peeking inside and finding his way into the into one more big fight, and he's just such he's such an amazing character in the history of the sport, because I was just looking at his Wikipedia page, and when you look at these guys, obviously Hagler retires after Leonard fight, and after fighting Leonard, after fighting Hagler, Leonard has I believe 3 or 5 more fights. But like Duran and Hearns, like they just keep going and going and going, and Duran fights until 2001, while Tommy's last fight was in 2006. Leonard comes back in '97, but that was just kind of like as a one-off thing, for him to face Camacho. But both of these guys continue fighting until much, much longer. And I don't know what it is, whether they needed the money, and probably they did. But just amazing how you have the two differences in, Leonard and Hagler. I'm sure for Leonard, a lot of it was him knowing that he lost a good chunk of his career, maybe the best part of his career in those 3 years where he stopped fighting. And maybe he just, he had to get the rest of that out of him. But just to see like Duran and Hearns, they just keep going and going and going and going. And not to say that, they did well or they did badly. They were competitive. I'm sure there was a lot of setup fights in there, but just the longevity and the ability for someone like Roberto Duran to have on record 119 fights is just crazy to me.
No, it is. I think, as you said, how long Tommy went on, he had some fights towards the end of his career on, supporting his son, Ronald Hearns, when he was upcoming. And I think the only thing that actually stopped Roberto in the end was that from fighting was that, he was in a car accident or something, and, he was no longer medically cleared to fight. So, both those guys' careers just went on and on and on. And, but, as we were saying, I think, it was all change in the middleweight division, with Hagler no longer, in command. As he stepped out of the picture, Leonard was gone as well. There was a land grab for those other belts. And, then when Leonard does decide to come back, it's not in that division. He joked after beating Hagler that he'd come back 15 pounds heavier, and he did. It wasn't immediately against Tommy Hearns, but he did chase that light heavyweight title. Yeah, and
this is if you ever have a chance to talk to these guys, like what is truly going on. Because rather than go immediately to a fight with Tommy Hearns, instead it was almost like Leonard looked for somebody who he thought would be a good person to promote with, but who he didn't really think he would have a lot of trouble with. And that brings us to Donnie Lalonde. And now Donnie Lalonde is kind of like the outlier here, because if people have heard of Donnie Lalonde, it was only because of this fight. And you didn't really hear anything from Donnie Lalonde after this fight. So who was Donnie Lalonde? Donnie Lalonde was a blonde Canadian fighter who he was the light heavyweight champion, but he was the light heavyweight champion in the sense of, you know, not very well known, not very highly thought of. And when you think about this, you say, you know, like you said, Ray just decided, he's like, oh, I'm going to just gain 15 pounds. He didn't really gain the 15 pounds to fight a guy who was clearly 20 to 25 pounds heavier than him, and even maybe more in sort of walk around weight. And the idea, at least to me, as I look back, was to create this thought that, you know, Leonard is actually trying to fight. It's David versus Goliath. If you look at the poster, the poster is them sort of standing back to back, and really the only time you stand back to back with anybody is to sort of measure your height against that person. And it's clear, like, Lalonde has like several inches on Leonard, and the poster makes it look like he's this humongous, imposing guy, and Leonard is this tiny man. But the reality of the situation is when you come to boxing skill set, Leonard is actually the imposing figure and Lalonde is the tiny man. So it was this big manipulation as far as trying to create some hype for a fight that, if you put boxing credentials into it, Lalonde can't even stand on the same stage as Sugar Ray. But when you throw out the idea of weight and size and little man beating big man, and if you remember, we are not that far removed from Michael Spinks beating Larry Holmes to win the heavyweight championship, and Michael Spinks coming up from the light heavyweight division. So this is kind of in play as a story for boxing. And so there's a couple of wrinkles to this fight which actually make it very interesting. And one of these wrinkles is basically Donnie Lalonde has one working arm, and he's he can throw his right hand, but his left arm is surgically repaired shoulder. If you look back at some of the newspaper articles heading into the fight, it's like Leonard is fighting this guy who not only he's clearly several classes above, but also has a handicap of only really being able to throw a right hand. Now, in this fight, as you watch the fight, Lalonde's left hand is actually a lot better than what people expected, but it's not strong. It's just usable. So you have that going for it. So people on the inside, and I don't know about people on the outside or sort of the casual fan who were just happy to see Leonard fight, but the people on the inside were just like, oh, this is just sort of like Leonard trying to con the people that, the tall, white, blonde kid is marketable. And so the other thing that I found amazing about this fight, and, because of what we cover pro wrestling on this website as well, is that Bob Arum, wants to, he wants a piece of this fight because he's thinking, long term as well, which is, Hearns and Leonard is kind of the end goal. So his idea is to help with this fight, and then put some guys on the undercard. I believe Michael Nunn being one of them, to kind of create a solid boxing card. But because Leonard, Leonard and Mike Trainer, they basically they're calling their own shots. They didn't like the deal, and so Bob Arum's like, okay, fine, like I'll just put Tommy Hearns and James Kinchin. It was actually James Kinchin is the replacement, but then he was just like, okay, well we'll just go 3 days ahead of you, and Tommy will fight on pay-per-view, and we're probably going to hurt your buy rate because we're on pay-per-view 3 days before you. So who comes in and helps with this process? None other than Vince McMahon and Titan Sports. So McMahon, and here's an interesting thing, which is people think that McMahon was actually part of the promotional team, which he wasn't part of the promotional team. He didn't have anything to do with hyping or really promoting it. I think he allowed the ads and stuff on his TV, and maybe Sugar Ray did something live for WWF at the time. I don't remember, but basically Vince McMahon was in charge of the pay-per-view and the closed circuit. And so McMahon puts up, I think it was $10 million or something, to get the rights to this. And so you know, what is his expectation? Well, his expectation is that he can sell this thing like, you know, he sold, you know, WrestleMania 3, just, you know, a year and a half prior. And that didn't work out. They run on a Monday night. WWF employees or Titan Sports employees tried to fudge the math a little bit, and you know, back then it wasn't about how many buys you got, it was about a percentage of households who actually had access to pay-per-view. And so when the numbers come out, WWE is claiming like a 700,000 buys show. And from everything I've read and everything I've sort of been able to find out, we talked about this last show, but Dave Meltzer, I asked him, and he said that back then when he heard what the buy rate was, it was about half of what WWE would have claimed. So closed circuit, pay-per-view, we're down. And so it's pretty clear that WWE loses a good chunk of money on this fight. And, you know, they only really have a piece of one more fight, another Sugar Ray fight down the line in 1997 against Hector Camacho, but they're out of the boxing game. And it's so funny to read the articles back then because WWE is like, oh, we're going to be in this for the long run. You know, we're going to help this stuff. Like, we know how to do this better than anybody. And they're basically one and done. So those are kind of the fun inside stories. And you know, Leonard struggles early on with Lalonde. He even gets dropped early in the fight, but he comes back and he's able to put Lalonde out. And you know, the one of the interesting things about Lalonde as a character is he, after this fight, he basically says that he's going to continue fighting because he's going to try to make his name and keep his name based off of fighting Sugar Ray. But soon thereafter, because of his background and because of his childhood in which his stepfather abused him, he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't in his heart be in a sport where he hurt, or his goal or the intention was to hurt another person. And even one in the contract, his cornermen were supposed to wear Coors logos on their gear, and they didn't, because Lalonde didn't want to promote alcohol when one of his goals was to help child abuse. So lots of weird things going on in this fight. All that to say, Sugar Ray easily beats him to set up this fight with Tommy. And so to kind of head into this fight, you had mentioned before we got on about one of the more interesting and really strategic things about this fight is no Angelo Dundee, no Jenks Morton in Leonard's corner, and he turns to somebody else who had helped him in the past to be his main guy. Yeah,
you know, it was all change. We had kind of a situation where, you know, in Tommy's corner, he'd kept the same team around him with Prentice Bird and Emmanuel Stewart from the first fight. With Leonard, he'd got rid of Angie. I think for the Lalonde fight, he stepped up the role of Jenks Morton. Then Jenks Morton stepped out of the picture as well, and you know, Dave Jacobs came back in, and the head coach was a guy called Pepe Correa, who was you know, somebody who had worked on the program that Leonard came through with Dave Jacobs initially. So he's a guy who wasn't well renowned within the sport of boxing, but was well familiar with Ray Leonard.
Yeah, and the story is that after the Leonard Hagler fight, in which was a financial success, like you know, better than you could ever imagine for Team Leonard, he and Angelo Dundee basically had a handshake deal of a specific amount of money that Dundee would make, and Dundee was frustrated with that amount because of the fact that they made so much more money. And when it came time for the Lalonde fight, Angelo Dundee actually wanted to create a contract. He wanted to have a contract, I'm sure, with incentives based on how much money Leonard was making. And Leonard took offense to that. And Mike Traynor took offense to that. And they were like, that's not the way we work. And like you said, Morton comes in. And then for the Hearns fight, Morton is out for similar reasons. But also, I read that, because he was in Ray's life for so long, he still sort of treated Ray as like, how an older person would treat a younger person who they've known forever, I'm sure, sort of like a kid or a son. And at this point in Leonard's career, he didn't like that anymore. And he didn't like to be treated like that. And so, that ended ties with both of those guys. But I guess the question is had Angelo stuck around, do you think either of the Lalonde fights or the Hearns fight would have been any different? Because Leonard doesn't think so for the Hearns fight. He doesn't think that if Angelo was in his corner that they would have done anything differently. But you do see a completely different Sugar Ray Leonard for both of these fights than you had previously seen before.
Yeah, it's a very different Ray Leonard. And we talked about last time how influential Angelo was on the tactics for the Hagler fight. We talked about how he came in early and him and Ray just sat there every day after training just breaking down what they were going to do. And there was times in both of these fights that I thought Ray looked a little bit lost. And, perhaps whether it was in preparation or it was in the ring himself, I think he maybe needed that guidance of Angie to pull him back on track.
And based on past performances, there was some right for folks to believe that Tommy, maybe he was shot, or maybe he wasn't the same guy, or maybe his legs, weren't going to hold up. And, go ahead and you can talk about the other performances coming up to this fight.
Tommy's goal, he did not want to retire at that point. He still wanted to become champion again. And, he targeted James Kinchin in the super middleweight division. The WBO, which was just formed as we mentioned earlier in the show, they decided to sanction that for his belt. It was Tommy's opportunity to beat Ray to the punch in getting his fifth title in his fifth division. Obviously, Ray had the match coming up with Lalonde, which was going to be for both his fourth and fifth world titles at the same time. It was a 168-pound fight. Lalonde was a 175-pound champion, so they put both belts on the line.
And can we step back for a second and think about how ridiculous that is? like Leonard at 168, Lalonde at 175, and in order for this fight to be for both titles, the bigger man has to come in at the smaller man's weight, and his title is still on the line.
I know it's crazy, but Tommy was, Tommy didn't have a good night against Kinchin at all. He did eventually win the fight, but he was badly hurt in it. He was holding on for a lot of that fight. One of the criticisms of Tommy and, his previous defeats is that he didn't know how to hold on. Well, he did in this one. He just clinched his way through it. He lost the point for it. He was maybe lucky not to be DQ'd, but he came out the other end and got the majority decision and won that fifth world title. Ray followed suit 3 days later. He won his fourth and fifth world title, and that's set up where we were with these two going into the big rematch. Obviously, neither guy has looked great in their previous fights, but it was a fight people still wanted to see.
And so, there was other talking points and stories to this fight. So we just talked about sort of the worry about Tommy. There was also some worry about Leonard. His personal life was a little bit in shambles. He and Juanita had been separated. He has been pretty candid about his drug issue. in his book and just in other books where, Ray talked, he was partying, and, in 1987, post 87, who's more famous than Ray Leonard in the sports world. So he's still sort of basking in the glow of that. And then the Hearns camp starts whispering about steroids. And we're still in, 1989 is not, in baseball, there is a steroid movement, though, again, it was mostly whispers. In the NFL, there were whispers, but there was no real drug testing. And so you have the Nevada State Athletic Commission basically saying, we don't believe that there is a steroid problem. We do not test for steroids, but if you want us to test for steroids, we can test for steroids before this fight. And I think at that point, the Hearns camp kind of let off the gas a little bit and just decided that maybe this is a little bit too late, or maybe whatever reason that they brought that up. But Leonard's excuse, and this is funny in hindsight, Leonard's excuse was that, well, when you get 33 years old, this is just what happens, which is actually the opposite of what usually happens when you get out of your athletic prime. But Mike Traynor was really furious because I think he thought that what they were actually doing was creating some doubt in case Leonard did win, that his win was legit. Now, in 1989, people probably should have known more about steroids and learned about them prior. There was, years and years and years and years and years prior of this stuff actually being involved in sports. You can go back to the Olympics, the East German swimming team, and so negligence, for the Nevada State Athletic Commission to not having tested for steroids at this point, it's more negligence than anything else, and just not being ahead of the game. And the fact of the matter is, you could have given Sugar Ray a test at that moment when you wanted, and it's more than likely that he was not going to fail, because he probably had, if he did do steroids, it probably had a lot to do with his training rather than to do with, the day before the fight or whatever. So, very interesting time, because it's really, in sports, this is the time, the late 80s, where this stuff starts becoming a little bit more popular. As a wrestling fan, you and I know far too much about steroids than we necessarily should, so we can't really look at it at that level, because we've just been, it's just been placed in front of us for all these years as pro wrestling fans, and now in the UFC too. But back then, you rarely heard anything about steroids being in the game, and it makes a lot of sense as to why it would be. Now, some guys will say, and this was in the lead-in to this fight, I believe it was, I want to say it was Lampley. I think Lampley had discussed it a little bit, but the idea was that boxing is a stamina game, and if you put this stuff into your body, it may work. Or actually, I take this back. I was watching a documentary on Tommy the Duke Morrison, who was well known for using steroids, but the excuse was boxing is a stamina game. It doesn't help you because it only gives you short bursts of strength, and in boxing you need to be able to last, for an entire 12 rounds. And at the time, maybe that was the smart thing to say, and it's probably foolish to look at it that way now. But really, this is kind of like a little bit of a red flag for the sport when the biggest fight in the sport for that year, as far as eyeballs, and one side is claiming that the other side is cheating.
Yeah, and it was just another kind of factor that was hanging over Leonard going into this fight. You talked about his separation with Juanita. He'd obviously had the time away from the ring as well, and with his injuries, and the physical limitations he might have going back to the ring. Then there was the allegations from Tommy's team, and his changed physically, and then also, as we said, there was the change in personnel in his team. So there was a lot of factors, hanging over Sugar Ray Leonard going into this fight.
And the last thing we should probably mention is, a couple days before the fight, Tommy Hearns has to deal with the situation of his little brother, who was watching his house while he was in Las Vegas. His little brother is charged with shooting his fiance. Now, Emmanuel Stewart had said in the past that I believe it was Hearns' father had passed away, and this was years and years and years ago. And news traveled differently probably as well, but he didn't want Hearns to know until after the fight, because he didn't know if he could handle it emotionally heading into the fight. Now, he had to tell, I don't know if he told Hearns or whatever, but the news did get to Hearns. So Hearns had to deal with this situation as he is heading into a really big fight. And so you add that to the other thing that he's dealing with, which is just this chip on his shoulder. I think he called it a nightmare, that he had the same nightmare for the last 8 years of letting the first Leonard fight slip away and thinking, if I would have only done this, or if I would have done this, I would have won that fight. So he's got a lot of things psychologically and emotionally. And, we talked about the shot fighter thing. So that's another sort of emotional and psychological thing. So he's got like a few different things, going on in his head. And then this last 24 hours or 48 hours before the fight, he's got to deal with this news of his brother. And, his brother actually just recently, as of this recording, about 2.5 years ago, got out of prison. Tommy had to pay a pretty big sum of money to settle the wrongful death lawsuit. But this is something that that happens, and you sort of forget about it, and then now you think back and go, oh wow, like his brother had literally just got out of jail, 2 years ago, and this fight happened in 1989. Like it's a crazy way to think about it. But so Hearns is dealing with some stuff, Leonard is dealing with some stuff, and so this is sort of like a grown man's fight. These two grown men dealing with things going on in their life, dealing with their own immortality in the ring, knowing that maybe their best days are behind them and now they got to get by less on skill and more on will. And that sets up, what happens on this day inside the ring. Now, the thing that's hotly debated about this fight, and I guess I wouldn't even say hotly, but we'll sort of get to the end story and then work a little bit backwards, which is this fight ends in a draw. And most people, including Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant, and Michael Nunn was also on this broadcast, but I think he talked twice in the 12 rounds. And so the announcers and a lot of the media thought this was a clear win for Tommy Hearns. I looked at this fight, and if you watch it as a whole, it does seem, because of 2 knockdowns, that Tommy Hearns is in control and probably wins it. But when you score it, you may get a different thought process on how close the fight was or wasn't. As you rewatched this fight and you looked back on it, what did your scorecard look like?
In the end, this is one I actually had 6 rounds apiece, and the differences for me were the 2 knockdowns that Tommy scored. Leonard, had Tommy hurt really badly in 3 separate occasions, but he never put him over. And I tend to not give a 10-8 round unless there is a knockdown. Now, one of the judges, the one who scored this a draw, I believe, the reason he made it a draw was he gave the 12 to 10-8 to Leonard without a knockdown, and that's the thing that made this a majority draw. For me, I thought Tommy won this fight. I thought when I watched it originally, I thought Tommy won it, and I thought when I watched it back, Tommy won it. It was as close as can be. As I said, I scored it in terms of rounds. I scored it even, but I thought those 2 knockdowns were the difference maker.
So I think our scorecards are very similar. The difference in my scorecard is I did give Leonard a 10-8 round, but it was in the 5th, and so I thought that
Leonard had 3 big rounds. I thought the 5th, the 9th, and the 12th, and the 9th was more just that. He hurt Tommy right at the end right on the bell. But at the 5th and the 12th, he was just pulverizing him for those whole rounds.
Yeah, and so my scorecard actually comes out exactly like one of the scorecards, which is 113-112 Hearns. And so do you have it 114-112?
Yes, 114-112.
114-112. So those I think those scorecards are pretty right on the money. I tried to figure out, because one of the scorecards was 113-112 Leonard, and I was trying to figure out where Leonard gets the extra round, because while I guess I just didn't find a lot of rounds very close or on or either guy rounds. I didn't think that there was close to like a draw round. I guess I could have done some research and probably found that person's scorecard, but it was Jerry Roth who had it. I think it was Jerry Roth who had it for Leonard. Can you defend that scorecard?
I think you can. If you look at it, there are this was a fight with big swings and momentum. For me, the first and the second round are both kind of close rounds, but you could I think I gave the first round to Leonard and the second one to Hearns. But you could switch either of those rounds around, because there was a very tentative start. It wasn't really till the third where Tommy got the knockdown and started to take over the fight that there was any kind of big impact made. And then straight away, even after that, the 4th round I gave to Leonard. I thought Tommy didn't really capitalize on the advantage he made from that. Ray went with a bit of a kind of a high risk, high reward strategy in that round where he put himself in the firing line. But it changed the dynamic of the fight a little bit, and he was able to. He was taking some shots himself, but he was able to get his own shots off, and and I think the fruits of that kind of came to the front in the 5th round when that was the round you said you gave him a 10-8, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, he had changed the dynamic of that fight a little bit by trying to make it a closer, more inside fight, and he landed with a big combination. I think it was an overhand right and then a left hook, which midway through the round, which had Tommy reeling, and he just chased after him and did everything to try put Tommy over, but Tommy was just not going down in that fight. So that is a fight, that is a round you could give him a 10-8 to as well. So there's probably 3 points within those first 6 rounds that you could swing.
So the looking at the punch statistics, after I watched this fight, What was super interesting is that when you look at the power shots, Leonard not only throws more, but he lands more than Tommy does. And, we talked a little bit about this earlier, which is the strategy from Leonard without Dundee. Does he fight a different fight with Dundee? But he really sits in the pocket and he trades with Hearns. There's not a lot of movement. He's not constantly moving like he was against Marvin Hagler. He's basically standing in front of Tommy and using his reflexes to see, what's coming and to not get caught. He does get knocked down twice in this fight. Now, I wouldn't say either knockdown was, him taking something flush. Like he was off balance on one of them because he kind of took like Hearns kind of hit him and kind of hooked the back of his head, and he was already kind of off balance. But it's interesting to see that, when you think of both of these guys, you see Tommy as like the power guy and Sugar Ray as the boxer. But in this fight specifically, Hearns throws and lands more jabs. Leonard throws and lands more power shots. It's a bit of a role reversal from what you come to expect out of each guy.
It is, but that was also kind of the case in the first fight a lot of the time, if you think about it. We talked about how Angelo Dundee said his guy was the puncher in that first fight. Where Tommy had success was when he used a jab, and that's what he had success with in this one as well. I think like all the things that Tommy made awkward for Ray, the physical advantages he has, how Ray's not being able to answer the jab, Ray not correctly judging the distance and getting caught with shots. They were all, even though they were both very different fighters at this stage in their career, those problems still persisted, and you could see that Ray had kind of formulated a strategy to try take some of that stuff away from Tommy by targeting the body and bringing his hands down. But he did. It wasn't really until he got into range and made it an inside fight or a close fight that he was able to actually kind of do some of that damage and draw those hands down and land some of the big shots. But I guess what I was going to say to you is, the first knockdown you had just mentioned, it was more of a cuffing shot. Tommy landed a right hand that kind of staggered Leonard, and then he followed it up with a cuffing shot around the back of the head that kind of sent him down. The second knockdown in the 11th round is very different in that, Tommy tees off with 3 huge consecutive right hands, and Ray goes down. And to me, I saw something that I don't think I'd ever seen in Ray's career before when he got back up, where he looked like he was beaten. Like, even in the first fight with Duran, when he was starting to lose his way, there was, you could see the wheels were turning there and he was looking for a way back into it. I thought when Ray got up after that knockdown towards the end of the 11th round, I thought he just had this look of like resignation, like, he felt this fight was gone. What was your thoughts on that?
I saw it as he was frustrated because his defense was just so terrible and lazy. He didn't even really move his feet. He was trying to move his head and his body to stay out of distance, which when you're fighting somebody with such a long reach is just lazy. Like if he takes one step back, Tommy doesn't hit him with probably 2 of those punches. But because Leonard is caught leaning and not moving his feet, he catches the shot and his just momentum takes him down. And I saw it as like, gosh, like that was so dumb. Why didn't I move my feet? Or, that shouldn't, I shouldn't get caught like that. And some of that might be the dejection from saying, a good version of myself never gets caught like that. But I just saw it as just like lazy defense, and all kudos to Tommy for throwing those shots because he could hit Leonard with them. But that's kind of the story. Like if you look at scorecards, that 10-8 because of that knockdown. maybe if Leonard doesn't get put down there, maybe he actually wins the fight, and people see this a little bit differently. But he goes down, and Tommy did a great job there catching him. And the other thing is, like, Leonard goes down twice prior in his career, and this is the first time he actually goes down twice in the same fight. So just seeing him go down again is an anomaly for anybody who had followed his career.
But I think, the next round, the 12th and final round, I think that's kind of, when you look for what makes Ray Leonard the great Ray Leonard, I think that's it. It's, the will to win that he showed in that 12th round, like after what we were saying, like, the dejection and, the beating he took in that 11, to come back out and, because I think in the 11th he came out with the idea of, I had to do something major to turn this fight around, and he got burned. Tommy caught him and knocked him down. In the 12th, I think that had been doubled. He knew this fight was almost out of his reach, and he needed something big to turn it around. And he wasn't afraid to go for broke once again. Even after how the last round had went, and this time, it almost worked for him. He really got to Tommy in that last round, and it looked almost like the ref could possibly step in at some point, to stop that beating. If there had been another round, maybe Tommy wouldn't have made it. But on Tommy's side, after fighting, tactically a near perfect fight, he corrected all the mistakes he made in their first fight. When he wouldn't hold on when he was hurt, or where he overexerted himself and emptied the tank. He corrected all that. But then in that 12th round, he almost undid all his good work, because he was the one who was ahead in the fight. He didn't need to go after Leonard, but he went out, to engage Ray and try put the icing on the cake with a knockout himself, and that gave Ray the opening.
What do you think about the reaction coming out of the decision? The crowd vehemently boos. They think that Hearns won the fight, but Tommy doesn't go there. He's actually almost relieved. Now, I'm sure he would have wanted his hand raised, but it was almost like, I know the performance that I put on, and I was able to exercise this ghost that has been following me for the last 8 years. But I think he may have said something that he thought he won the fight after the fight was over, but he was very agreeable with the cards, and basically said, when it goes to the cards, you just have to respect what happens at that point. What did you take that as? Yeah,
I know Ray particularly was, happy with the decision. I think he thought he got the rub of the green. I think in years since, he's kind of said that maybe Tommy deserved that fight. From Tommy's perspective, I think, there was a huge amount of this was he wanted to prove people wrong who said he was over the hill, or, said he couldn't take the big shot. And, I think it was important for him that he didn't get knocked down when Ray was pouring it on him, and that he made the final bell. And I think, we talked about how important it was for him to exercise the demons from that fight, how that they'd haunted him for those 8 years. I think, by just going the distance with Ray and, even getting a draw, he came out of this like he took something back. He may not have gotten the win, but, he didn't lose either.
Yeah. So you would think that there would be a third fight on the horizon based on the decision in the second fight. Now, coming out of that, Larry Merchant suggested that there would be a third fight. There was talk about, of course, Hagler coming back, and you mentioned the sort of the senior circuit. That was the idea, but they would never get to a third fight. Our next non-bonus episode, because we will have a bonus episode the next time where I talked to Robert Silva, who I believe was at the closed circuit for the first Leonard and Hearns fight. So he has tons of thoughts and memories of that fight. But the next episode with you and I is going to be Leonard and Duran. And so after Leonard and Duran, there was talk about Leonard and Hearns 3. Let's do it again. And the main issue with having that third fight is that it was just too hard for Hearns to make a weight that Leonard wanted to be. Leonard wanted, let's go again at 164. And by then Hearns was just like, I'm just too big. It's too hard to make that weight. And that's one of the main reasons why it didn't happen. Were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
And so it just seems like after a non-decision here, that it would have been, very easy. Now, who knows if they could have sold it the way that, Sugar Ray is not fighting for peanuts, right? And they got a guarantee. Leonard got the $13 million guarantee. Hearns got an $11 million guarantee. They each got a piece of the gate and the pay-per-view and all that stuff. And so they made a good amount of money. But would the public, do you think the public would have bought a third fight? And let's say that, it's even 2 years later than this one. So you put, both guys in their mid-30s. They're, maybe they do have to fight at a slightly heavier weight. I don't know if the public necessarily buys it outside of, we know Sugar Ray and we know Tommy, and maybe it can do some business. But I don't think it was going to be a juggernaut, specifically since this one wasn't that big of a juggernaut.
Yeah, the narrative coming out of this fight seemed to be, for most people, that, it was a great fight, but, it was a fitting note for both of these guys to, bow out on. That maybe, their time had passed and it was time to let new guys through. It was Tommy who was kind of treated more as the winner of this fight. And, there was kind of rumblings that maybe a second fight with Hagler would be on the cards. But, Hagler had mentioned that, it would be something he'd consider for if there was $20 million on the line. And just with the performance of Leonard Hearns too at the closed circuit, it was quite disappointing, and I think that just kind of put paid to the idea of them doing that seniors tour. I just don't think it would have made cash common sense to do it at that point with these guys. As I said, sometimes it's just a time for new guys to step up, and I think that's where we reached with this series. When we went back to the first episode, we kind of spoke about how this era had a special place in history in between when Ali's reign had ended, and there was a gap for that new star at heavyweight. At this point, we're now at a time when there's been a new heavyweight sensation on the scene. Someone who's different than anyone else before. Iron Mike Tyson had become heavyweight champion of the world in 1986, and in 88 he'd had that big breakthrough year where he knocked out Holmes, Tubbs, and Spinks in short order, and I think he was where the eyes were in boxing at that point. So maybe by the time this fight came around, it was just time to say goodbye to this era, and there was a new stars to carry on the mantle.
Yeah, and so we're nearing the end here. Like I mentioned, we only have one real fight left, which is Leonard and Duran 3. We are going to have the bonus episode, like I mentioned, and then you and I are going to get back after that one with sort of an epilogue, and where we know, okay, where did everyone go, after Leonard and Duran, and we can talk a lot about that. And then we'll have one more episode that's sort of, related to the Fabulous Four, but also maybe about where they are historically and who you can compare other boxers, including more recent guys, to them as well. So I think we're in a pretty good place with this fight. It was really fun fight to watch, and I think it even won. Did Ring Magazine give it like Fight of the Year or something like that?
No, it didn't. It actually, it probably could have, but Roberto Duran pipped them with his win over Iran Barkley. That's what ended up being Fight of the Year. But I guess just to kind of close out on this, I wanted to go back to what Kimball said on it. Because we talked a little bit about the start of, what this fight meant, or, how these guys were matched at this point in their career. And what Kimball said about it was, he said, it was spirited and savage, if technically imperfect match, in which the advantage repeatedly changed hands, and in its conclusion, the judges determined that it was a fight neither man decided to deserve to lose. If both had slipped, they'd slipped to the same level and were more evenly matched than ever. What do you think on that?
That's actually an amazing way to look at this, right? Because they were so even in that first fight, and it was maybe intangibles that and a lack of Tommy being able to hold on, that allowed Sugar Ray to come back. He just had that determination, and now they both probably lose about the same amount of athletic ability or whatever. And so they are pretty even, and Tommy's got the length, but Leonard, is such a sharp mind, and you can see him game planning the entire time. And then you talked about that 12th round, like, who's got more will, and even in the broadcast, I think it was I can't remember if it was Lampley or Merchant, but they were saying, like, here's what makes Sugar Ray Leonard, and he said something to the effect of, like, is there anybody else who's got the sheer will and determination to do this? And what's funny about that statement is, again, Michael Nunn is sitting right next to him and not saying a word. And so it's just like, you're talking about one of the best guys to ever do it, but not only athletically and not only from a skill set and not only from a draw, but just from sheer will and determination. And maybe, if we can sort of bookend this whole thing, like, maybe that fight with Roberto Duran, it had to happen that way in order for Sugar Ray to have that in him, so late in his career, because he had to go through that before. And so, we can make all kinds of different, parallels or whatever, but just, you mentioned hearkening back to that first episode too. And, it's literally like sheer will and determination that gets him to the end of this fight. One in which, he could have quit probably a couple different times, and it's just, what a big heart on that guy. And, in his post 80, post first retirement, actually, that's actually what's most impressive about him. Whereas in the beginning of his career, it wasn't. You didn't think about that. It was his skills, and it was his smile and his ability. And when you think about him later in his career, it is like that determination and that spirit.
Well, I guess, to wrap up the rivalry of Leonard and Hearns, I'll ask you this. The first fight, if it had been a 12-round fight, Tommy would have won.
Yep.
This fight was a 12-round fight. It's arguable that he did win. Was Tommy just a better fighter than Ray Leonard over 12 rounds? And if this one had went another round, or if it had been scheduled for 15, would Ray have then taken over and had the decisive finish he had last time?
I think yes to that. I don't know if Tommy was the better 12-round fighter. What I think is, he was just a great matchup for Leonard, right? He was a puzzle for Leonard. Like there's a point in this fight where Leonard is like, I can see him thinking, and the thing that I'm thinking is like, he is trying to figure this thing out as he's in the ring, because Tommy is befuddling him, and he's just such a thinker. But Hearns' length, his right hand, his jab, it was just a problem for Leonard, you know, more so than most other matchups. Like, just, you know, Leonard could usually sort of figure it out, but for whatever reason, until Tommy got tired, he was just one of the harder guys for Leonard to figure out.
Yeah, I you know, and I think, you know, that probably would have been always been the case. You know, Tommy just had, you know, he's such a unique physique. He's such a unique boxing style, and, you know, obviously he had, you know, such good pedigree as well. I think, you know, he was always going to be a handful for anybody, but, you know, I think just the way he matched up with Ray made it tricky for him, and, you know, maybe he was Ray's ultimate career rival because of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, because just stylistically, everybody has their match. You know, you mentioned Mike Tyson, and like, what was Mike Tyson's kryptonite was, you know, someone who could keep him at bay with their reach, but also was not afraid and trusted their defense to stay sort of inside, so that Tyson couldn't just dominate that game. Like for Ray, Tommy's patience and his trust in his skill set and all of those things, you know, Ray, you know, what was also interesting, we didn't really bring this up, but early on in the build, Leonard tried to psychologically take Hearns out of the game by making fun of his intelligence, right? Like, Tommy doesn't speak very well. He's not, you know, he's kind of a dumb guy, like those kind of things. But Tommy just didn't bite, right? Like, maybe Hagler bit, and those things visibly frustrated Hagler. And Tommy was just like, hey, man, it is what it is. And so Leonard really couldn't also get that psychological edge on him this time in this fight. So, you know, I think Tommy played it perfectly. And, you know, gosh, what a close matchup of two of the best ever.
Yeah, and next time we are going to take things full circle. We're finishing off with back where we started. It's Leonard Duran one more time, the 7th of December '89 at the Mirage Hotel and Casino. So the rubber match, they're one apiece. After beating Barkley, Duran had kind of bragged that Ray had to win this fight against Tommy so he could fight him in the third one, and they could settle their differences one last time. So that's what we were headed for. Ray didn't win the fight, but Roberto still got that last payday.
He did, and it was a big payday too. You know, I think Leonard's guarantee was about 15, and Duran's was 7 or 8 or whatever. But still, Duran is always lurking, and always was able to sort of remake himself, which makes him sort of like the Madonna of the Fabulous Four. But okay, so we will be back. Like I said, I'll have a bonus episode with Robert Silva before we get to Duran and Leonard for the third time. So for Duan, I'm Double G. We will see you when we see you. Peace out.